The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the federal courthouse as Thomas Mitchell adjusted his worn tie for the third time. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cool autumn air, but from the weight of what lay ahead. At 68 years old, Thomas had faced enemy fire, survived 3 tours in Vietnam, and rebuilt his life from nothing more than shattered memories and a Purple Heart. Yet standing before these imposing doors, he felt more vulnerable than he had in decades. The lawsuit had been brewing for months. What started as a simple dispute over his veterans' disability benefits had escalated into something much larger. The Department of Veterans Affairs had not only denied his claim for increased compensation due to his service-related injuries, but they had also questioned the validity of his military records. Someone in the bureaucracy had flagged inconsistencies in his file, suggesting that his accounts of his service might be exaggerated or even fabricated. Thomas's lawyer, Sarah Chen, a sharp young attorney who specialized in veterans' rights cases, had warned him that today's hearing would be crucial. The government's legal team had been aggressive, picking apart every detail of his service record with surgical precision. They questioned his medals, his unit assignments, and most painfully, the circumstances that led to his injuries during a rescue mission in 1971. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense. The hearing room was packed with observers, including several reporters who had caught wind of the case. Veterans advocacy groups had rallied around Thomas's story, seeing it as representative of a larger problem within the VA system. On the other side, government attorneys sat with thick folders and laptop computers, their confidence evident in their posture and whispered conversations. Judge Margaret Reynolds, a respected federal judge with 20 years on the bench, called the hearing to order. Her reputation for fairness was well known, but she also had little patience for frivolous claims or wasted time. The government's lead attorney, Richard Holloway, stood to present their opening argument. Holloway was methodical in his approach, laying out what he called significant discrepancies in Thomas's military file. He pointed to gaps in documentation, questioned the authenticity of certain commendations, and suggested that Thomas might be suffering from false memories related to his documented PTSD. The attorney's tone was professional but cutting, each word designed to chip away at Thomas's credibility. Thomas sat at the plaintiff's table, his weathered face stoic as Holloway dissected his life's most defining moments. Sarah occasionally placed a reassuring hand on his arm, but she could feel the tension radiating from her client. This wasn't just about money or benefits anymore. This was about honor, truth, and the validation of sacrifices made half a century ago. The government's case seemed airtight. They had expert witnesses ready to testify about the unreliability of combat memories, psychiatrists prepared to discuss how trauma could create false narratives, and bureaucrats who would explain why certain documentation might be missing or incomplete. Holloway painted a picture of a well-meaning veteran whose mind had gradually transformed routine service into heroic mythology. When Sarah stood to respond, she knew she was fighting an uphill battle. The evidence she had gathered was compelling, but largely circumstantial. She had tracked down a few surviving members of Thomas's unit, but their memories were also decades old. She had military historians who could speak to the chaotic nature of record-keeping during the Vietnam era, but that only explained why documentation might be missing, not whether Thomas's claims were true. What Sarah did have was Thomas himself. Despite the government's attempts to discredit him, his story had remained consistent through hours of depositions and cross-examinations. The details he provided about locations, operations, and people had checked out wherever verification was possible. But in a legal system that demanded concrete proof, consistency and character sometimes weren't enough. The hearing proceeded through the morning with witness after witness. Government experts testified about the fallibility of memory and the common tendency for veterans to embellish their experiences over time. They weren't questioning Thomas's service or his injuries, they emphasized, just the specific circumstances he claimed had caused them. Thomas's advocates pushed back with their own experts, describing the well-documented phenomenon of missing Vietnam-era records and the systematic destruction of files that had occurred in the 1970s. They brought in veterans who could speak to the reality of operations in Thomas's area of service, painting a picture of chaos and heroism that made his claims entirely plausible. As the lunch recess approached, it was clear that the case could go either way. Judge Reynolds had listened intently to all testimony, occasionally asking pointed questions that revealed nothing about her thinking. The packed courtroom had remained remarkably quiet throughout the proceedings, as if everyone understood they were witnessing something significant. Thomas himself had not yet testified. Sarah had decided to save his testimony for the afternoon, hoping that his personal account might provide the emotional weight needed to tip the scales. But as they walked to a nearby cafe for lunch, she could see the toll the morning had taken on her client. The old veteran looked exhausted, his usual straight posture slightly bent under the weight of having his life's defining moments questioned and analyzed. Other diners in the cafe recognized him from news coverage and offered quiet words of support, but Thomas seemed lost in his own thoughts. The afternoon session would determine everything. Sarah knew that Thomas's testimony alone might not be enough to overcome the government's technical arguments. She needed something more, something that could cut through the legal maneuvering and bureaucratic doubt to reach the fundamental truth of what had happened in a jungle clearing 50 years ago. What she didn't know was that sitting in the back of the courtroom, an elderly man in a crisp Navy uniform had been listening to every word of the morning's proceedings. Admiral James Morrison, recently retired after a distinguished career, had read about the case in the morning paper and decided to observe the hearing. Something about Thomas's name and the details of his service had triggered a memory, a connection that had taken him most of the morning to fully process. As court reconvened after lunch, the Admiral remained in his seat, his weathered hands folded, over a small notebook he had been writing in during the break. He had not planned to speak, had not even planned to stay for the entire hearing. But sometimes, he reflected, the most important moments in life were the unplanned ones. Thomas Mitchell walked back to the witness stand with measured steps, his polished shoes echoing softly in the hushed courtroom. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows cast a golden glow across the room, but Thomas felt none of its warmth. He had been dreading this moment for months, knowing that his entire future would depend on his ability to convince a room full of strangers that his memories were real, his service was genuine, and his sacrifices had meaning. Judge Reynolds administered the oath with her usual efficiency, and Thomas raised his right hand, the same hand that had once gripped an M16 rifle in the humid jungles of Southeast Asia. His voice was steady as he swore to tell the truth, though he wondered if anyone in the room truly wanted to hear it. Sarah Chen began with gentle questions, establishing Thomas's background and early life. Born in a small farming town in Iowa, Thomas had enlisted in the Army at 18, driven by a sense of duty and a desire to serve his country. His voice carried traces of his Midwestern upbringing as he described his basic training, his specialized instruction as a medic, and his deployment to Vietnam in 1970. The courtroom listened as Thomas painted a picture of a young man thrust into an incomprehensible war. He spoke of the monsoon rains that turned everything to mud, the constant threat of sniper fire, and the bonds formed between soldiers who knew they might not see tomorrow. His unit, Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, had been stationed near the Cambodian border, conducting search and rescue operations for downed pilots and missing personnel. Richard Holloway, the government attorney, watched Thomas carefully, occasionally making notes but mostly studying the witness's demeanor. He was looking for inconsistencies, nervous tics, or signs that the story was rehearsed rather than remembered. But Thomas spoke with the quiet authority of someone recounting lived experience, his details specific and his timeline clear. The pivotal moment came when Sarah asked Thomas about March 15, 1971, the date that would define the rest of his life. Thomas paused, his eyes focusing on something beyond the courtroom walls, as if he could see across the decades to that humid morning when everything changed. A helicopter had gone down deep in enemy territory, Thomas explained. The pilot and co-pilot were alive but trapped in the wreckage, surrounded by North Vietnamese forces. Command had deemed the location too dangerous for a standard rescue operation, but Thomas and 3 other volunteers had insisted on attempting a ground approach under cover of darkness. As Thomas described the mission, his voice took on a different quality. The careful, measured tone of his earlier testimony gave way to something more immediate, more visceral. He spoke of crawling through elephant grass for hours, the weight of his medical kit cutting into his shoulders, the sound of enemy voices drifting through the darkness. They had reached the crash site just before dawn, Thomas continued. The pilot, a young officer named David Chen, was unconscious with a severe head injury. The co-pilot, Sergeant Rodriguez, had a compound fracture of his left leg and was losing blood rapidly. Enemy forces were closing in, and Thomas had to make a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The plan had been to carry both men to safety, but Rodriguez was too badly injured to move quickly. Thomas made the agonizing choice to splint the sergeant's leg as best he could and leave him hidden in the wreckage while he carried the unconscious pilot to the extraction point. He promised Rodriguez he would come back, a promise that would drive him to attempt the most dangerous action of his military career. Holloway leaned forward as Thomas described what happened next. The government attorney had been waiting for this part of the story, the part that seemed most implausible according to their experts. Thomas claimed that after successfully evacuating the pilot, he had returned alone to rescue Rodriguez, fighting his way through enemy positions and carrying the wounded sergeant nearly 2 miles to safety. The official records, Holloway noted, showed only that Thomas had been wounded during a routine patrol and that both pilot and co-pilot had been recovered by friendly forces. There was no mention of Thomas's individual heroism, no citation for extraordinary valor, just a Purple Heart for wounds received in combat. Thomas's jaw tightened as he explained the discrepancies. The chaos of war, he said, often meant that heroic actions went unrecorded or were attributed to entire units rather than individuals. Command had been focused on the successful rescue of the aircrew, not on documenting exactly how it had been accomplished. By the time Thomas had recovered from his own injuries, the paperwork had been filed and the official story set. Sarah guided Thomas through the aftermath of the mission. He had been hit by shrapnel during the second rescue attempt, wounds that required multiple surgeries and months of rehabilitation. But the physical injuries paled in comparison to the psychological trauma of what he had witnessed and done. Like many Vietnam veterans, Thomas had struggled with what would later be diagnosed as PTSD, though such understanding was decades away. The government's cross-examination was thorough and sometimes brutal. Holloway questioned every detail of Thomas's account, pointing out the lack of corroborating evidence and the convenient absence of documentation. He brought up Thomas's struggles with alcohol in the years following his return, his failed marriage, and his periodic mental health treatments, suggesting that these factors might have contributed to false or embellished memories. Thomas weathered the attack with dignity, acknowledging his personal struggles while maintaining the truth of his military service. Yes, he had drunk too much in the early years after Vietnam. Yes, his marriage had failed partly due to his inability to talk about what he had experienced. And yes, he had sought help for the nightmares and flashbacks that plagued him. But none of that changed what had happened on March 15, 1971. The cross-examination stretched into the late afternoon, with Holloway pressing Thomas on increasingly minute details. What was the weather like? How many enemy soldiers had he seen? What type of ammunition had he been carrying? Thomas answered each question as best he could, but the government attorney was clearly trying to exhaust the witness and expose inconsistencies. Judge Reynolds called for a brief recess as the day wore on, and Thomas stepped down from the witness stand feeling drained. The faces in the courtroom were hard to read, some sympathetic, others skeptical. He had told his truth, but he wasn't sure it had been enough. During the break, Admiral Morrison approached Sarah Chen. The elderly naval officer introduced himself quietly, explaining that he had been following the case and had some information that might be relevant. Sarah listened with growing excitement as the Admiral outlined what he knew, but she cautioned him about the implications of what he was suggesting. When court reconvened, Sarah requested permission to call an additional witness. Holloway objected, arguing that the witness list had been finalized weeks earlier, but Judge Reynolds allowed the Admiral to approach the bench for a sidebar conference. After a brief discussion, she ruled that the Admiral could testify, provided his testimony was directly relevant to the case at hand. Admiral Morrison took the stand with the bearing of a man accustomed to command. His uniform was immaculate, his posture erect, and his voice carried the authority of 4 decades of naval service. As he was sworn in, Thomas looked at him with curiosity, wondering how this distinguished stranger could possibly be connected to his case. The Admiral's opening words would change everything. Admiral James Morrison adjusted his position at the witness stand, his steel-gray eyes scanning the courtroom before settling on Thomas Mitchell. The room fell into an expectant silence as Sarah Chen prepared to question this unexpected witness. Even Judge Reynolds leaned forward slightly, intrigued by the Admiral's sudden appearance in what had been a straightforward veterans' benefits case. "Admiral Morrison," Sarah began, "could you please state your full name and current position for the record?" "Rear Admiral James Morrison, United States Navy, retired as of 6 months ago," he replied, his voice carrying the crisp authority of a lifetime in military service. "I served for 38 years in various capacities, including naval aviation, intelligence operations, and strategic planning." Thomas studied the Admiral's face, searching for some sign of recognition but finding none. He had never seen this man before, yet something about his presence suggested that their paths had crossed in ways Thomas couldn't yet understand. Sarah continued her examination carefully, establishing the Admiral's credentials and his reason for being in court. Morrison explained that he had read about the case in the Washington Post and had felt compelled to attend the hearing. As he listened to the testimony, certain details had triggered memories from his own service record. "Admiral, during your career, did you serve in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam conflict?" Sarah asked. "Yes, I did. I was a young Navy pilot, flying missions from the USS Constellation. My call sign was Dragon 6, Morrison replied, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "I flew close air support missions, search and rescue operations, and some classified missions I still cannot discuss in detail." The Admiral's mention of his call sign sent a ripple through the courtroom. Call signs were deeply personal identifiers in military aviation, known only to fellow service members and those who worked closely with aircrew. Thomas felt a strange stirring of memory but couldn't quite place it. "Admiral, do you recall any specific missions or operations from March 1971? Sarah asked, her heart racing as she approached the critical moment. Morrison's expression grew somber. "March 15, 1971 is a date I will never forget. My aircraft was shot down during a reconnaissance mission near the Cambodian border. My co-pilot, Petty Officer Rodriguez, was severely injured in the crash. I was unconscious for most of what followed, but I was told later that ground forces had risked their lives to extract us from enemy territory." A gasp went through the courtroom as the pieces began to fall into place. Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat as memories he had tried to bury for 50 years suddenly came flooding back. The unconscious pilot he had carried to safety, the young man whose life he had saved at tremendous personal risk, had been this distinguished admiral. "Admiral Morrison," Sarah pressed, "do you remember anything about your rescue? Any details about the personnel who saved your life?" Morrison's eyes found Thomas across the courtroom, and for a moment, 50 years seemed to melt away. "I was drifting in and out of consciousness, but I remember fragments. Strong arms lifting me, someone telling me everything would be okay, the sound of gunfire in the distance. The man who carried me to safety was hit by enemy fire during the rescue, but he never let go of me." The Admiral paused, his composure wavering for the first time. "When I regained full consciousness 3 days later in a field hospital, I was told that an Army medic had saved my life. But in the confusion of the evacuation and my subsequent medical treatment, I never learned his name. For 50 years I've wondered about the man who risked everything to save a stranger." Richard Holloway was frantically shuffling through his papers, trying to find some way to challenge this unexpected testimony. The government's entire case had been built on the premise that Thomas's account was unverifiable and possibly fabricated. The appearance of the actual pilot he claimed to have rescued was devastating to their argument. "Admiral," Sarah continued, "are you certain that Mr. Mitchell was the medic who rescued you?" Morrison stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. "When I heard him testifying about David Chen and Sergeant Rodriguez, I knew. But there's something else, something that only the man who saved me would know." The courtroom was completely silent now, every person hanging on the Admiral's words. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, caught up in the drama unfolding before them. The medic who rescued me whispered something to me as he carried me through the jungle, Morrison said, his voice thick with emotion. He kept saying it over and over, probably to keep himself calm as much as to comfort me. He called me by my call sign, even though he had no way of knowing what it was. He must have heard it on the radio during the initial distress call. Thomas felt tears stinging his eyes as the memory crystallized, the weight of the unconscious pilot in his arms, the terror of enemy forces closing in, the desperate need to keep both of them alive. And yes, he remembered now. The fragment of radio chatter he had heard before the crash, the voice calling for Dragon 6 to respond. "What did he say, Admiral?" Sarah asked softly. Morrison's voice broke slightly as he replied. He kept saying, "Stay with me. Dragon 6, we're going home, Dragon 6. Just hold on. Dragon 6. That medic saved my life not just physically, but mentally. His voice was the anchor that kept me from slipping away. The courtroom erupted in a buzz of conversation. Before Judge Reynolds gavelled for order, Thomas was openly weeping now, overwhelmed by the validation of memories he had been forced to defend and justify. For 5 decades he had carried the weight of that day alone, never knowing if the men he had saved had survived, never receiving recognition for his actions. Holloway attempted to cross-examine the Admiral, but his questions seemed petty and desperate in the face of such powerful testimony. He questioned the reliability of 50-year-old memories, suggested that the Admiral might be confused about dates or circumstances, and even implied that the dramatic timing of his appearance was suspiciously convenient. Morrison weathered the cross-examination with the patience of a man who had faced far more intimidating challenges. He acknowledged that some details might be imperfect after so many years, but his core recollection remained unshakable. He had been saved by an Army medic who knew his call sign, and that medic matched Thomas Mitchell's description and account in every significant detail. "Admiral Morrison," Holloway finally asked, "isn't it possible that you're simply confused about the identity of your rescuer? That your gratitude has led you to see connections that don't actually exist?" The Admiral's response was immediate and forceful. "Counselor, I've spent my entire adult life in situations where attention to detail meant the difference between life and death. I may not remember every conversation I had last week, but I remember with absolute clarity the voice that kept me alive when I was closest to death." As the Admiral stepped down from the witness stand, he walked directly to where Thomas was sitting. Without a word, the two men embraced, 5 decades of unspoken gratitude and recognition passing between them. The courtroom watched in respectful silence as the pilot and the medic, now elderly men marked by time and service, finally completed a conversation that had begun in a jungle clearing half a century earlier. Judge Reynolds called for a recess to allow emotions to settle and to give both legal teams time to process this dramatic development. As people filed out of the courtroom, many wiping away tears, it was clear that something fundamental had shifted in the case. The government's technical arguments about missing documentation and unreliable memories seemed trivial compared to the living testimony of the man whose life Thomas had saved. But the hearing was not over, and unexpected testimony, no matter how dramatic, would still need to be weighed against legal standards and procedural requirements. The case that had begun as a routine benefits dispute had become something much larger, touching on questions of honor, memory, and the value of military service. The afternoon recess stretched longer than usual as Judge Reynolds retreated to her chambers to consider the extraordinary turn of events. The hallways outside the courtroom buzzed with conversation as lawyers, reporters, and observers tried to process what they had just witnessed. The reunion between Thomas Mitchell and Admiral Morrison had transformed what many expected to be a dry administrative hearing into something approaching theater. Richard Holloway paced in the government's makeshift conference room, his confidence severely shaken. His entire strategy had been built on the premise that Thomas's claims were unverifiable, existing only in the unreliable memories of an aging veteran. The appearance of Admiral Morrison hadn't just provided verification, it had elevated Thomas's actions to a level of heroism that made the government's position seem petty and bureaucratic. "We need to regroup," Holloway told his team of junior attorneys and VA representatives. "Morrison's testimony is compelling, but it doesn't necessarily prove every detail of Mitchell's claim. We still have legitimate questions about the scope of his injuries and the extent of his disability." But even as he spoke, Holloway knew his position had become untenable. The optics alone were devastating. The government arguing against a veteran whose heroism had been confirmed by a distinguished admiral. The legal merits of the case suddenly seemed secondary to the broader question of how America treats its war heroes. Meanwhile, Thomas and Admiral Morrison sat in a quiet corner of the courthouse cafeteria, finally able to speak freely after 50 years of separation. The Admiral had brought a folder with him, containing documents and photographs that told the story of his career from a different perspective. After I recovered from my injuries, I tried to find you, Morrison explained, showing Thomas a letter he had written to the Army's personnel office in 1971. But the paperwork from that operation was classified, and the bureaucracy was impossible to navigate. Eventually, I had to accept that I might never know the name of the man who saved my life. Thomas studied the Admiral's service record, seeing a career marked by distinction and advancement. Morrison had gone on to command aircraft carriers, serve in the Pentagon, and advise 3 different presidents on naval strategy. His success stood in stark contrast to Thomas's own struggles in the years following Vietnam. I always wondered if I had done enough, Thomas said quietly. If the risks I took were worth it, if the men I saved went on to live good lives. Seeing what you've accomplished, knowing that those few minutes in the jungle led to all of this, it gives meaning to everything. Admiral Morrison shook his head firmly. Thomas, you saved more than my life that day. You saved my future, my wife's husband, my children's father, my grandchildren's grandfather. Every promotion, every command, every moment of happiness in my life exists because of your courage. The conversation was interrupted by Sarah Chen, who approached their table with obvious excitement. Admiral Morrison, I've been researching your service record, and I think I found something that could be crucial to our case. She produced a thick manila folder containing photocopied documents from the National Archives. Your rescue mission was actually documented, but the files were classified for 30 years and then misfiled. I had a researcher track them down this afternoon. The official after-action report specifically mentions an Army medic who displayed extraordinary valor in rescuing downed aircrew under heavy enemy fire. Thomas felt a surge of vindication as Sarah read from the dusty documents. The report described his actions in clinical military language, but the facts were unmistakable. He had indeed returned to enemy territory to rescue Sergeant Rodriguez, had been wounded by shrapnel during the extraction, and had single-handedly saved 2 lives at considerable personal risk. There's more, Sarah continued. The report was filed with a recommendation for the Silver Star, but it was never processed due to administrative confusion during the unit's redeployment. The paperwork got lost in the system, and by the time anyone noticed, the witnesses had scattered and the opportunity had passed. Admiral Morrison examined the documents with the practiced eye of someone familiar with military bureaucracy. This is exactly the kind of thing that happened all too often during Vietnam. Heroic actions went unrecognized because of paperwork failures and communication breakdowns. When court reconvened, the atmosphere had changed completely. Judge Reynolds took her seat with an expression that suggested she had used the recess to thoroughly research the case and its implications. She had clearly been moved by the morning's testimony, but she was also aware that her ruling would set important precedents for how the legal system handled similar cases. Sarah presented the newly discovered documents as evidence, over Holloway's strenuous objections. The government attorney argued that the documents were hearsay, that they had been conveniently discovered at just the right moment, and that their authenticity was questionable. But his argument sounded increasingly desperate as the weight of evidence mounted against his position. Judge Reynolds allowed the documents into evidence after examining them carefully and questioning the archivist who had located them. The chain of custody was clear. The documents bore official seals and signatures, and their contents corroborated Thomas's testimony in remarkable detail. The final blow to the government's case came when Sarah called Sergeant Rodriguez to testify via video link from his home in Arizona. Now 75 years old and confined to a wheelchair, Rodriguez had followed the case on the news and asked to participate. His testimony was brief but devastating to Holloway's position. Thomas Mitchell saved my life, Rodriguez said simply, his weathered face filling the courtroom's video screen. I was bleeding to death in that wreckage, and he came back for me even though it meant going through enemy lines twice. I've lived with the memory of his courage every day for 50 years. Rodriguez explained that he had also tried to nominate Thomas for a medal after the war, but had been told that the necessary paperwork had been lost. Like Admiral Morrison, he had wondered for decades about the fate of the medic who had risked everything to save him. Holloway's closing argument was perfunctory, a half-hearted attempt to salvage something from a case that had completely collapsed. He argued that regardless of Thomas's heroism, the specific medical claims and disability ratings still needed to be evaluated through proper channels. But his words rang hollow in a courtroom that had witnessed the reunion of heroes and the validation of long-buried truth. Sarah's closing argument was passionate and personal, arguing that Thomas's case represented everything wrong with a bureaucratic system that questioned the word of veterans rather than honoring their service. She painted a picture of a hero denied recognition for 50 years, forced to prove his own courage in a court of law because administrators valued paperwork over people. Your Honor, Sarah concluded, this case is about more than disability benefits or medical evaluations. It's about whether we trust our veterans to tell the truth about their service, whether we honor the sacrifices they made, and whether bureaucratic convenience should override human dignity. As Sarah returned to her seat, Thomas looked around the courtroom one final time. The faces that had seemed skeptical that morning now showed respect and admiration. Admiral Morrison sat in the front row, still in his dress uniform, a living testament to the value of Thomas's actions. Sergeant Rodriguez watched from the video screen, tears streaming down his face as he relived memories of courage and salvation. Judge Reynolds announced that she would render her decision the following morning, giving her time to review all the evidence and testimony. As the court adjourned, Thomas felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in decades. Regardless of the legal outcome, the truth had finally emerged from the shadows of bureaucracy and doubt. The validation he had received from his fellow veterans was worth more than any monetary award or official recognition. After 50 years of silence, the voice that had once called out Dragon 6 in a jungle clearing had finally been heard and understood. The federal courthouse was already bustling with activity when Thomas Mitchell arrived the next morning, despite the early hour. Word of the previous day's dramatic testimony had spread throughout the veteran community and beyond, drawing crowds of supporters who lined the courthouse steps. Local news crews had set up their equipment and reporters pushed forward with microphones and cameras as Thomas made his way through the crowd. Thomas walked with a different bearing than he had just 24 hours earlier. The weight of doubt and shame that had pressed down on his shoulders for decades seemed to have lifted, replaced by a quiet dignity that came from having his truth finally validated. Admiral Morrison walked beside him, the two men having spent the evening sharing stories and filling in the gaps of 50 lost years. Inside the courthouse, the hearing room was packed beyond capacity. Judge Reynolds had moved the proceedings to a larger courtroom to accommodate the public interest, but even that space was straining to hold everyone who wanted to witness the conclusion of what had become known as the Dragon 6 case. Veterans from multiple conflicts filled the seats, their presence a show of solidarity that transcended generational and service boundaries. Sarah Chen had arrived early to review her notes one final time, though she knew there was little more she could do. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony was compelling, and the moral weight of the case was undeniable. But she also understood that legal decisions weren't always based solely on emotion or even justice. Technical requirements, procedural, rules, and bureaucratic considerations could still complicate what seemed like a straightforward resolution. Richard Holloway looked haggard as he took his seat at the government's table. He had spent much of the night on conference calls with his superiors at the Department of Justice and the VA, trying to find a face-saving way out of an increasingly untenable position. The optics of fighting against a certified war hero were terrible, but admitting defeat could set precedents that might complicate thousands of other cases. Judge Reynolds entered the courtroom promptly at 9 o'clock, her expression revealing nothing about her decision. She had clearly spent considerable time preparing her remarks, with multiple folders and legal texts arranged on her bench. The room fell into complete silence as she prepared to speak, the kind of profound quiet that seemed to absorb all sound and motion. This case, Judge Reynolds began, has presented the court with issues that extend far beyond the specific legal questions originally at hand. While we began with a straightforward dispute over disability benefits and medical evaluations, we have encountered fundamental questions about justice, truth, and how our society honors military service. She paused to look around the packed courtroom, her eyes settling briefly on Thomas and Admiral Morrison before continuing. The court has carefully reviewed all testimony, examined all evidence, and considered the legal precedents that apply to this case. But I must also acknowledge that some situations transcend pure legal analysis and demand that we consider broader principles of fairness and human dignity. Thomas felt his heart racing as Judge Reynolds laid out the technical aspects of her decision. She systematically addressed each of the government's arguments, examining the questions of evidence, documentation, and procedural requirements that had formed the basis of the VA's denial. Her analysis was thorough and methodical, showing respect for the legal process while building toward her conclusion. The government has argued that Mr. Mitchell's claims cannot be substantiated due to missing documentation and the unreliability of decades-old memories, Judge Reynolds continued. However, the testimony of Admiral Morrison and Sergeant Rodriguez provides compelling first-hand corroboration of Mr. Mitchell's account. The recently discovered military documents further support his version of events. The judge's tone began to take on a more personal quality as she addressed the broader implications of the case. More troubling to this court is the apparent assumption by government agencies that veterans' accounts of their service should be viewed with suspicion rather than respect. While proper verification procedures are necessary and appropriate, there is a difference between reasonable skepticism and systematic doubt. Admiral Morrison straightened in his seat as Judge Reynolds' words echoed his own feelings about how Thomas had been treated. The Admiral had been shocked to learn that a man who had saved his life was being forced to prove his heroism in court, subjected to cross-examination that questioned not just specific details but his fundamental honesty and character. The court finds, Judge Reynolds announced, that Mr. Mitchell's service record, as corroborated by witness testimony and documented evidence, fully supports his claims regarding the circumstances of his injuries and the nature of his military service. The government's denial of his disability benefits claim was therefore improper and must be reversed. A cheer went up from the gallery before Judge Reynolds gavelled for order. But she wasn't finished with her remarks, and her next words would carry implications far beyond Thomas's individual case. Furthermore, she continued, this court is deeply concerned by the pattern of bureaucratic obstruction and adversarial treatment that Mr. Mitchell has faced. The Department of Veterans Affairs exists to serve those who served our nation, not to subject them to unnecessary challenges and doubt. The aggressive legal position taken by the government in this case suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between our country and its veterans. Judge Reynolds' voice carried a note of anger that surprised many in the courtroom. Known for her measured judicial temperament, she was clearly moved by what she had witnessed over the past 2 days. Mr. Mitchell has been forced to endure not only the original trauma of combat and injury, but also decades of bureaucratic indifference followed by a legal process that questioned his integrity and character. This is not how a grateful nation should treat its heroes. The judge ordered immediate reinstatement of Thomas's benefits at the highest possible level, along with retroactive payments dating back to his original claim. But more importantly, she directed the VA to conduct a comprehensive review of their claims processing procedures, with particular attention to cases involving missing documentation from the Vietnam era. The court also strongly encourages the Department of Defense to review Mr. Mitchell's service record for possible recognition that may have been overlooked due to administrative failures, Judge Reynolds added. The testimony and evidence presented here suggest that significant acts of valor went unrecognized, not due to any shortcoming on Mr. Mitchell's part, but due to systematic failures in military bureaucracy. As the judge concluded her remarks and the gavel fell for the final time, the courtroom erupted in sustained applause. Veterans who had been sitting in silent support throughout the hearing rose to their feet, many with tears in their eyes. The victory belonged not just to Thomas but to all who had faced similar battles with an unresponsive system. Thomas sat in stunned silence for a moment, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred. Sarah Chen embraced him warmly, her own eyes bright with tears of relief and triumph. But it was Admiral Morrison's steady hand on his shoulder that grounded him in the moment. "It's over, Thomas," the Admiral said quietly. "The truth has finally been heard." Outside the courthouse, the media frenzy was intense but respectful. Thomas found himself surrounded by reporters asking for his reaction, but he struggled to find words adequate to the moment. How do you summarize 50 years of doubt and pain finally being resolved in a single morning? "I never wanted recognition. For myself," Thomas finally said, his voice carrying clearly in the autumn air. "I just wanted people to know that the men I served with were heroes, that their sacrifices mattered, and that the truth was worth fighting for." Admiral Morrison stepped forward to address the crowd, his uniform drawing respectful attention from the gathered veterans. "Thomas Mitchell saved my life when I was a young pilot, but today he saved something even more important. He saved the principle that our nation honors truth over bureaucracy, courage over convenience." The Admiral's words carried particular weight given his distinguished career and recent retirement from active duty. His willingness to publicly criticize the system he had served for nearly 4 decades demonstrated the depth of his feelings about Thomas's treatment. In the weeks that followed, Thomas's case would indeed prompt broader changes within the VA system. Judge Reynolds's sharp criticism had been noted at the highest levels of government, leading to policy reviews and training programs designed to ensure that veterans receive the benefit of the doubt rather than systematic skepticism. The Pentagon also acted on Judge Reynolds' suggestion, conducting a comprehensive review of Thomas's service record. The review confirmed every detail of his account and led to the recommendation for several medals that had been lost in the bureaucratic shuffle of 1971. The Silver Star that should have been processed 50 years earlier was finally approved, along with a Bronze Star and a Combat Medical Badge that recognized his extraordinary service as a medic. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source: Admiral M. 2 years after the courtroom victory that had changed his life, Thomas Mitchell stood at the podium of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., preparing to deliver a speech that would mark the culmination of an extraordinary journey. The morning was crisp and clear, with golden autumn light filtering through the trees that surrounded the black granite wall bearing the names of more than 58,000 American servicemen and women who had died in Southeast Asia. The occasion was the dedication of a new addition to the memorial complex, the Recognition Wall, a project inspired by Thomas's case and funded largely through Admiral Morrison's Dragon 6 Foundation. The wall would honor the thousands of veterans whose acts of heroism had gone unrecorded due to the chaos of war and the failures of military bureaucracy. Thomas's own name was among the first inscribed on the new wall, along with a brief description of his actions on March 15, 1971. But as he looked out at the assembled crowd of veterans, their families, and government officials, he knew that his individual recognition was less important than what it represented for countless others who had served without acknowledgement. Admiral Morrison sat in the front row, now serving as the Foundation's president and the driving force behind numerous reforms in how the military and VA handled veterans' claims. Beside him sat Sergeant Rodriguez, who had flown in from Arizona despite his declining health. The 3 men had become close friends over the past 2 years, bound together by shared experience and mutual respect that transcended the decades that had separated them. "When I walked into that courtroom 2 years ago," Thomas began, his voice carrying clearly across the memorial grounds, "I was fighting for more than disability benefits or medical recognition. I was fighting for the truth, for the validation of memories that others had dismissed as unreliable or even fabricated." The crowd listened intently as Thomas described his long journey from the jungles of Vietnam to the halls of justice. He spoke about the decades of doubt and self-questioning, the nights when he wondered if his memories were real or simply the product of trauma and wishful thinking. "But I wasn't fighting alone," Thomas continued, gesturing toward Admiral Morrison and Sergeant Rodriguez. "Every veteran who has ever struggled to prove their service, every hero who died without recognition, every family member who wondered about the truth of their loved one's sacrifice, they were all with me in that courtroom." The speech was being broadcast live on C-SPAN and streamed online, reaching an audience far beyond those physically present at the memorial. Veterans organizations across the country had organized viewing parties, and the response was overwhelming. Thousands of veterans who had faced similar struggles with the VA system saw their own experiences reflected in Thomas's story. One of those watching was Maria Santos, a Marine Corps veteran who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan. Like Thomas, she had faced skepticism from VA administrators who questioned her accounts of combat exposure and the circumstances of her injuries. Inspired by Thomas's victory, Maria had filed her own lawsuit and was now working with the Dragon 6 Foundation to document her case. The foundation had grown rapidly in the 2 years since its establishment, handling hundreds of cases and achieving a success rate that far exceeded traditional legal channels. The key to their effectiveness was treating each veteran as an individual with a unique story. Rather than as a case number in a bureaucratic system, Admiral Morrison had used his Pentagon connections to push through systematic reforms in how military records were maintained and how veteran claims were processed. The changes weren't revolutionary, but they represented a fundamental shift in attitude, from skepticism to support, from burden of proof to benefit of the doubt. The most significant change was the establishment of the Veterans Truth and Reconciliation Commission,
modeled after similar bodies that had addressed historical injustices in other countries.
The Commission's mandate was to investigate cases where veterans' service had been inadequately documented or recognized, with the goal of providing closure and appropriate recognition for their sacrifices. Thomas had been appointed to serve on the Commission. Despite his initial reluctance to take on such a public role, he had spent his entire adult life trying to avoid attention, preferring the quiet dignity of private remembrance to the spotlight of public recognition. But Admiral Morrison had convinced him that his voice was essential for other veterans who lacked the platform to tell their own stories. The Commission's work was painstaking and often heartbreaking. They reviewed thousands of cases involving missing documentation, unrecognized valor, and bureaucratic failures that had denied veterans their rightful recognition. Some cases dated back to World War II, others to more recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. One case that particularly moved Thomas involved a Korean War veteran named Robert Kim, whose Medal of Honor recommendation had been downgraded to a Silver Star due to racial prejudice in the 1950s military. Kim had died decades earlier, never knowing that his extraordinary heroism had been deliberately minimized because of his Asian heritage. The Commission's investigation led to the posthumous award of the Medal of Honor, presented to Kim's children at a White House ceremony. Another case involved a female Army nurse from Vietnam whose Bronze Star had been denied because military leadership at the time didn't believe women should receive combat decorations. The Commission's work resulted in not only her individual recognition, but also a comprehensive review of gender discrimination in military awards, leading to dozens of additional recognitions for female veterans. The emotional toll of the Commission's work was significant, but Thomas found it deeply meaningful. Each case represented a life touched by injustice, a story that deserved to be told and acknowledged. The bureaucratic failures that had nearly destroyed his own sense of self-worth were part of a much larger pattern of institutional indifference to individual humanity. As Thomas concluded his speech at the memorial dedication, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that morning, when he had walked into the federal courthouse with trembling hands and uncertain hopes. The victory in court had been important, but it was really just the beginning of a much larger transformation. "The wall behind me bears the names of those who gave their lives for our country," Thomas said, gesturing toward the black granite of the Vietnam Memorial. "This new wall honors those who gave their service and their truth, often without recognition or reward. Both walls remind us that heroism comes in many forms, and that our duty to honor that heroism doesn't end when the shooting stops." After the ceremony, Thomas walked slowly along the Vietnam Memorial Wall, searching for familiar names among the thousands inscribed in the granite. He found several, friends from his unit who hadn't made it home, fellow medics who had died trying to save others, young men whose lives had been cut short by a war that many Americans preferred to forget. Admiral Morrison joined him at the wall, both men standing in respectful silence before the names of the fallen. The Admiral had made this pilgrimage many times over the years, but it carried special meaning now that he understood more fully the sacrifices that had been made to save his own life. "Do you ever wonder what they would think about all this?" Admiral Morrison asked, nodding toward the new recognition wall where crowds were still examining the freshly inscribed names. Thomas considered the question carefully before answering. I think they would be proud that the truth finally came out, that their service meant something beyond just surviving another day. But mostly I think they would want us to take care of the ones who are still here, still fighting battles that shouldn't need to be fought. As the sun set over the memorial grounds, Thomas felt a sense of completion that had eluded him for most of his adult life. The young medic who had carried an unconscious pilot through enemy territory 50 years earlier had finally completed his mission. Not just the rescue operation that had defined his military service, but the larger mission of ensuring that truth prevailed over bureaucracy. That individual sacrifice was honored over institutional convenience. The courtroom had gone silent when Admiral Morrison revealed Dragon 6's call sign, but that silence had given way to a voice that spoke for all veterans who had served without recognition. Thomas Mitchell had found his voice and in doing so, had helped thousands of others find theirs as well.